Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with our Old Testament survey. We're up to the book of Ecclesiastes now. We're getting close to the end of the wisdom literature. Next week we'll do Song of Solomon. This week it's Ecclesiastes. This is an unusual book. I think that'll become clear as to why as we walk through it together. The title is simple enough. It comes from the Greek, first from the Greek term. The Latin was transliterated into Latin and then into English. Do you hear another word in there as you hear the word Ecclesiastes? Oh, sorry.
Ecclesia?
That's right.
Is that right?
Exactly. And what does ecclesia mean?
Assembly.
Okay, so assembly. And so that's connected to, let me get to the right source here.
Can we work on it, or you want to wait?
I'm good. I think, does it usually give, it's showing up here.
There you go.
Thank you for letting me know. In the term ecclesia, there's this idea of one who calls an assembly. We think of a town crier that came into a public square with news. He would call out to people to gather together to hear it. We have our term church. Ecclesia is the Greek word there for those that are called out by God through the gospel. Well, Ecclesiastes has that same idea. The Hebrew word is koheleth, and it means one who calls or assembles together the people. Now, it's translated in the book typically as preacher, and that's not a bad word to use necessarily, but it's not usually the one that we associate with. We think of a preacher as somebody who stands up on Sunday morning, teaches the Word of God. That's not exactly what Solomon was doing in this case. He was calling the people together as a sage, as a teacher of wisdom. He was teaching them in the same way that a preacher would, but it's just one of those things where we think of that term as one thing that somebody does on Sunday mornings typically. He was doing it in a little bit different way. It did fit with his role as a sage, as a teacher of wisdom. Now, Ecclesiastes is another book in the Old Testament where the author himself is never explicitly identified, but it's clear enough, it seems to me, as you read the verses, that it is Solomon. Ecclesiastes 1:1 says, the words of the preacher of Koheleth, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Well, that certainly narrows it down. Ecclesiastes 1:12 speaks of the preacher who had been king over Israel in Jerusalem. So Solomonic authorship, I think, is pretty clear from those verses. The wisdom, wealth, and great building projects that are described in Ecclesiastes match up well with what we read about that Solomon did in 1 Kings 2 through 11. Chapter 12, verse 9 of Ecclesiastes speaks of one who taught the people knowledge and wrote many proverbs. That, again, points to Solomon. So it seems, as you look at the wisdom literature as a whole, that Solomon, in all likelihood, we can't say definitively, that he wrote the Song of Solomon early in his life, perhaps before he had all the multiplicity of wives that he ended up having. He wrote the Proverbs over the course of his life. Those were written in collections over the course of his life and reign. And then he wrote Ecclesiastes near the end of his life. He's looking back over all those things that he had done earlier in his life. And he's asking some pretty hard questions. Hard in the sense of really trying to understand the meaning of life. Trying to understand what profit is there for man and all his activity under the sun. Now, this is a book that, depending on who you read or what commentator, you can reach very different conclusions as to what the overall message of the book is. Some people say that Solomon is a cynical pessimist. Why would they say that?
It's all vanity.
Vanity of vanities. I mean, you don't get too far in the book until you hear him say, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And he says that 2 or 3 times over the course of the book. Now, people that take this view, and Ben Ware is one of them, for those of you that are reading a survey of the Old Testament by Ben Ware, say that Solomon is assuming a secular or unbelieving stance, and he's kind of looking at life apart from any acknowledgement of God, apart from any revelation from God. I think that's way off base, because as you read, it's true that he has these refrains, vanity of vanities, but he also has a number of times where he says, fear God, 5 different times he says that. He talks about God's sovereignty. So even though this was a popular view for a long time, I don't think that really does justice to the book. Now, the second approach is the complete polar opposite of being a cynical pessimist. These people would say that Solomon is a hedonist. And that's because at 7 different points in the book, he has these enjoy life commands. And it's almost as if he's looking at life and talking and seeing how futile it is. And he says, well, let's just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
Can you define hedonist?
Hedonist in the sense of seeking pleasure as the ultimate goal of life. Just as an aside, John Piper talks about Christian hedonism, which is a really jarring term in my mind, but as he explains it, it becomes more clear. He's saying your delight should be in God, always, and that makes sense. But hedonist as a philosophy is pleasure-seeking, and Solomon certainly examines that as part of his investigation. But again, people reach this conclusion because of these refrains 7 different times. Solomon says something like this. The first one of these is in Ecclesiastes 2:24. He says, there's nothing better for man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen that it is from the hand of God. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? That sounds like a good thing. Doesn't necessarily sound like hedonism, but it's definitely, he's saying both of these things in the same book. So it is a little bit hard to reconcile how he would do that or why he would do that. So can you anticipate then what the third view is? What would lie between hedonism and pessimism from a biblical point of view?
My husband told me realism.
Realism. I think he's a realist. He's a biblical realist. And what he's doing is reflecting on life under the sun in a sin-cursed world, in a curse that came from God as a result of man's initial fall. He's looking at life under the sun in light of creation being subjected to futility. You're familiar with that verse. Paul says in Romans 8, for the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but because of him who subjected it. Who subjected it to futility? God did. Why did he subject it to futility? What's the next? I didn't complete the verse there. What are the next words? He subjected it to futility in hope. So the curse of sin came about as a result of man's fall, but there's hope in the sense that God has provided a means for reconciliation and salvation. Solomon's not looking at that. He's looking at the way life is under the curse. Okay? He's also offering his conclusions on how to deal with life accordingly. So, even though he says up front, vanity of vanities, he says it again at the end of the book, that's somewhat of a preliminary conclusion. He says he has another conclusion after that, at the very end of the book, that's very orthodox and very in line with what we hold to as believers. We'll look at that when we get there.
Frank,
Yeah.
you said this very well. You're not saying that vanity of vanities is not orthodox.
No, I'm not. I'm kind of just arguing against those who would take that as the major premise of the book, and that somehow that means that Solomon is taking the stance that he doesn't know God. To me, that's a very hard case to make. I mean, God appeared to Solomon on 2 different occasions, and he does say 5 times in the book to fear God. So it doesn't seem to me that he's doing that at all.
You got to read the whole book.
That's right. That's a very important point. I think I've mentioned that before, maybe last week or a couple of weeks ago. This is a book that Solomon purposely takes us through these things to point out the futility of life, the seeming inequities of life, to bring us to that final conclusion at the end. So it's very important to look at the whole book, and very important especially to read all the way to the end and see what his final conclusion is. All right, we're going to look at the structure of the book in two different ways. This first one is more detailed, and this one's from Dave Duell, who was my professor in seminary and really gave me a love for this book. This is a book that I didn't have a very good understanding of early in my life, even though it is a good book for young people to read. But let's walk through this one first, and then we'll look at another one from David Dorsey that's much more compact, and I think they both have their strengths. As I read Dorsey, I continue to appreciate him. I just think he has some really helpful insight into all the Old Testament books. So we start off with the title, The Words of the Preacher, or of Koholeth, son of David, king in Jerusalem. We have his conclusion stated in verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And then he launches into this poem. The first line is, what advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? That's really the question he's trying to answer in the book of Ecclesiastes. When he says all his work, he's not just talking about the kind of things that you do 9 to 5 as somebody's employee. He's talking about all the activity that we do on the earth in this life. He's trying to say, what profit is there? In one sense, he's asking, what's the meaning of all this? What's the big picture of life? And then he gives this poem. I do want to read these verses. We obviously won't read every verse in the book, but this kind of sets the tone for the rest of the book. So let's look at it. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. What does he mean by that?
That's the stable factor in this equation. I mean, things keep happening the way they always have.
And what's the unstable factor?
Well, when we kind of go and, we change. People who's here.
Okay, so we die, right? I mean, we're only here for a short period of time as compared to the whole of time. Not even just the whole of history, the whole of eternity. I'm just talking about since creation has been in existence, let's say 6,000, 7,000 years. We live at best 100 years, typically 70 to 80 years, and we're just here for a very short period of that totality of time. And so he's asking a question about that. What's the point if we're just going to be here for this short period of time? And what's the meaning of this whole thing we call life? And then he gives 3 illustrations from nature. The sun rises and the sun sets, and hastening to its place, it rises there again. Now, as I read these 3, I want you to tell me what's common to all 3 of them. First is the sun. Second is the wind. Blowing toward the south and turning toward the north, the wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses, the wind returns. Then the rivers. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place where the rivers flow, there they flow again. What's common to all 3 of those illustrations?
Activity without an ending.
Okay, activity without an ending, without seemingly accomplishing a purpose. And what is there's another element, or another way to say that same thing, really. Circular. I mean, from our point of view on the earth, it just looks like the sun is just circling from one end to the other. It does it every day, over and over again. When he's talking about the wind here, I don't think he's talking about going out and seeing wind swirl around a bunch of leaves or even something like a tornado. He's talking about wind currents that go around the earth. I think about jet stream, though I typically think about jet stream as kind of going more west to east. He's talking about north to south in this case. But I do think that's the issue. It's circular currents of wind that we know go around the earth. Rivers maybe aren't as circular, but the idea is that they flow from one point to the other, and but they never fill up the next source. It's just over and over. So as you read this, it's almost wearying to read. It's kind of monotonous, and that's the way he wants it to be. That's what he says in the next verse. All things are wearisome. Man is not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear filled with hearing. I think he's making a comparison here between these illustrations in nature and what we experience in life. I mean, there's a certain monotony to our life. I think you probably experience it more or realize it more as you get older. But, we get up, we go to work, we eat, we go home, we go to bed, and it's just over and over again. And again, eventually we die. Death comes to everybody. That's a main theme in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so he's asking questions, what's the point if we're all going to die in the end? He goes on to say in these first 11 verses, is there anything of which one might say, see this as it's new? Already it has existed for ages, which were before us. Now, I don't think he's saying there that there's absolutely nothing new. I mean, you look at technology and we see new things that have never been seen before. Think about computers as an example. But he is saying there's a sense in which it's just a different way of doing things. I mean, men have always had means of calculating, so it's not absolutely new in that sense. But again, he's just looking at life and saying, there's nothing new under the sun. That's the way he says it in another place. There's no remembrance of earlier things, and also of the later things which will occur. There'll be for them no remembrance among those who will come later still. Now again, not in an absolute sense. Certainly we have history, we have access to history, and we can recall things that people have done in the past. But how often do we do that? We're more preoccupied during the time, more preoccupied with the things that we live and experience ourselves than we are with things that happened hundreds of years ago. Typically, not absolutely. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and now he moves into kind of an explanation of this investigation that he's going to launch in for the first half of the book. He says, I set my mind to think and explore by wisdom. Remember, he had lots of wisdom. God had given him lots of wisdom concerning all that's been done under heaven. It's a grievous task which God has given to the sons of men to be afflicted with. So he's saying even the investigation of trying to find out the meaning of life is a hard thing. It's a hard thing to try to understand and to do. I've seen all the works which have been done under the sun. Behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. Ever tried to catch the wind? It's a hard thing to do. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. Now that's a phrase that's intriguing. God is the one that controls what's been bent that can't be straightened. And I think a lot of what Solomon's doing in the book of Ecclesiastes is recognizing that there's certain things that we don't have any control over. There's certain things that we don't know that God does know. And this is kind of connected to that. I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has observed a wealth of knowledge, wisdom and knowledge. So, if anybody could have been able to figure out the meaning of life, it seems like Solomon should have been able to. He had more wisdom than anybody. I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after wind. Because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Why would he say that? Do we have another saying that we talk about, that we use in our time, that kind of matches up with what he says here?
Ignorance is bliss.
Ignorance is bliss. There's times where the more you know, the more questions that you have. It doesn't really bring satisfaction to have a tremendous amount of knowledge and wisdom. Now, he's going to talk about that in this book, and he's going to compare living according to wisdom with living according to folly. And he says there's no contest. Wisdom is far better than folly, but wisdom itself is still very limited. You can get all the wisdom that you can as a human being and still not know the kinds of things you would like to know to be able to have the best life possible. And ultimately what he's going to say is that you have to trust God. God is the one who has that kind of wisdom, that knows everything, that knows the beginning from the end. He's given us his revelation so that we do know some things that are coming in the future, perhaps not as much as we'd like in our own personal lives, but we know him and we can trust him with that. But he's going to kind of take us through this investigation to lead us to that conclusion. So his investigation largely takes up the first half of the book, from 1:12 to 6:9. We read his explanation of that in verses 12 through 18. He investigates pleasure again, as the means for fulfillment in life. I don't think he's condemning pleasure. Pleasure, too, is a gift from God. But when you make it the end, when you make it the thing that you want more than anything else, or you kind of arrange and aim your life towards pleasure, it's not going to fulfill. And he reaches that conclusion as well. He, again, compares wisdom and folly in chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. And he says, I turn to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. So certainly wisdom and living according to wisdom is a lot better than living according to foolishness. But he also says in verse 15, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. You know, it takes a lot more work to be wise than it does to be a fool. Proverbs encourages us to work hard to gain wisdom and knowledge. Well, he's saying here, I'm going to die just like the fool is. What's the point? Why work hard to be wise if the end is going to be the same for both of us? Wisdom, you know, we've talked about the wisdom literature and how important, how much of an impact it can have on the choices that we make and the life that we lead. Ecclesiastes really looks at wisdom in a very critical way. It says, yeah, it's a good thing. It's a lot better than foolishness, but it doesn't answer everything. Think about Solomon. I mean, this was the guy who had all the wisdom in the world, and in the end, he not only died, but he turned away from God before he died. Okay? Then he talks about his investigation of labor and rewards. Work is a major theme in this book. And again, he's asking the question, what's the profit of all this work? He cites an example at one point of a man who has no heir, he has no other family, and he's out there working himself to death to get more and more. And he's saying, well, what's the point? I mean, this guy's not going to have anybody to pass it on to. He's going to end up dying as well. Why not rest a little bit instead of working continually? And maybe you know some people like this. I mean, we talk about people today being workaholics. There are people that is the thing that motivates them is work, climbing the corporate ladder, or, you know, even just that's the thing that they love to do. And again, work itself is not a bad thing. Work is a gift from God. And he's going to make that point here as well. But any of this stuff in the extreme, or any of it as the means for finding ultimate satisfaction in life, is going to be found wanting. And he just talks about some of the different things there. The fact that you leave them to somebody else, even if you do have an heir. You die, and all that you've worked to accumulate, you end up passing on to somebody else, and you don't know how they're going to handle it. They may be wise or foolish. You can't always know the right time to act. Chapter 3 is a chapter about time and about God's control over time. When it says there's a time to give birth and a time to die, those are times that are ordained by God. And yet, too, as human beings, we can recognize that there are distinctions in those kinds of times. He says in verse 11 of chapter 3, God has made everything appropriate in its time. He's also set eternity in their heart, that is, in humans' hearts, so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. That's another major theme of this book, is man doesn't have God's wisdom, he doesn't have his perspective, and he can't know the big picture the same way that God can. Okay? He talks about in chapter 4, verses 7 through 16, some of the different situations you find yourself in work. He says at one point, you know, you can break through a wall and get bitten by a serpent. You can dig a pit and end up falling into it. Just there's the possibility of accidents involved in work. He says it's better if you don't have to work alone. Why? Why is it better to have more than one person if you're doing any kind of work?
Getting a bind, you can help you.
Okay, you get in a bind, you need help, it's better to have two people. What else? What if you do get hurt and you're off somewhere by yourself? He just makes the point that it's better to have somebody working with you. And then another, as far as rewards go, he talks about the fact that somebody can live a wise life, he can prosper under God's hand, and yet he can lose it all through a bad investment. And again, if he knew that it was going to be a bad investment ahead of time, he would have made it, right? He would not have made it. But man doesn't know that. And we all, we have a portion that God gives us when we come into this life, and we try to work with that portion, and God gives us certain abilities to do work, and we try to grow that portion and use it to provide for our families. But we have limited knowledge as to what's going to happen in the future. And that's what Solomon is kind of bemoaning here. All right, so the first half of the book has to do with his investigation of life and his asking all these different questions. In the second half, he's drawing conclusions from his investigation. A lot of it has to do with the problem of not knowing, particularly not knowing the way God knows. Man can't always find a route which is the most successful for him to take because his wisdom is limited. Again, for another example, let's say that you're in the rental home business, or you're into the business of flipping houses. If you knew what the housing market was going to do, you'd always buy low, hold on to it, and sell high. If you knew what the stock market was going to do, you'd do the same thing. You don't know those things. And so you do the best you can with the wisdom that you have, but you don't know how it's going to turn out. All right, I'll just let you read some of those. Again, there's another comparison with wisdom and folly. There's just kind of some different subtopics under this big idea of man can't always find the right way or the right way to go because his wisdom is limited. Man also doesn't know what will come after him. He knows he's going to die. Solomon, he's comparing what it's like to live on this earth and be able even to serve and praise God with what it's like in Sheol, in the grave. And he's saying, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. Well, a dog wasn't very highly thought of in biblical times, and a lion was, but it's much better, his point is, it's much better to be among the living than it is among the dead. And yet he knows that's the fate of every man. Man doesn't know the time of his death. He doesn't know what will happen to him. He doesn't know what evil will come. He doesn't even know what good will come. He talks about in chapter 11 some very practical explanation of why you diversify your investments, because one can fail and one might prosper. That's the whole principle of financial diversification, is in case one of them goes really south, you still have the other one that have the possibility to make money. So there is this joy refrain that runs through the book, and we see it at the end. Man should enjoy life, but not sin, because judgment will come to all. Judgment is a big part of the book of Ecclesiastes, recognizing that God will judge in the end. He'll judge the wicked who may seem to prosper in this life. He'll also judge the righteous. And the righteous recognize that, and they fear God accordingly, and they make their decisions accordingly. There's an epilogue at the end of the book, and that's where the ultimate conclusion comes. The end of the investigation, when one has come to realize the effects of the curse and the limitations of wisdom, is fear God and keep his commandments. Again, we have the concept of fearing God throughout the book, but that's the final conclusion. Even after the last vanity of vanities, all is vanity, Solomon says, the conclusion when all has been said and done is fear God and keep his commandments, for this applies to every man. All right, I know I went through that very fast. The best thing to do with this book, I hope after you listen to me this morning, is to read through it again, and read through it at one sitting. And you'll see some of the things that I'm talking about. You might want to even read it alongside one of these two outlines. The second outline from Dorsey, as you might expect, is in the form of the chiasm. It's very interesting, and I think he makes a very good case for this being the structure of the book. This is a book that, as you look at different Bible books, some of them are really hard to outline, and this is one of them. And you look at men that have studied Ecclesiastes through the years, they come to very different conclusions as to how the book is broken up into different units. So he's done that, Dorsey has, and this is the one that he's come up with. We have the title and the author in the third person in chapter 1, verse 1. And then we have a poem about the brevity and insignificance of life. We read that in verses 2 through 11. We have in 1:12 through 2:26 wisdom's failure to discover life's meaning. Wisdom is a great thing, but it can't answer all of our questions. There's certain things that God hasn't let us know, and we have to come to grips with that. Then we have the poem about time in chapter 3, 1 through 15. And then we have the center of the book in 3:16 to 6:12. That is, fear God. And again, in this chiastic structure, the center is the point of emphasis. So he says, fear God, learn how to understand the world's moral perplexities, and enjoy life despite them. You know, you're not always going to have joy in this life, but you've got to realize that, and then you enjoy life anyway, as a gift from God. All right. Then as we continue through, we see that there's correspondence in the units that come later in the book. There's another poem about time revisited in chapter 7. Now you might not see that at first glance. There's two different kinds of chapters in 3 and 7. 7 is a lot of Proverbs, like what we studied in the book of Proverbs. But the topics that are covered in both chapters are remarkably similar. Time, death, birth, mourning, laughter, and destruction are spoken about in both chapters. So it seems as if in chapter 7, he's giving advice on how to deal with the fact that we don't know what's going to happen in time. Even though God said eternity in our hearts, we can't know what's going to happen in the future. And so chapter 7 corresponds to chapter 3 in that way. He revisits wisdom's failure in chapter 7, 15 through 10, 19. And again, this is practical advice in light of that failure to explain life's meaning or its perplexities, and an encouragement to guide your life by wisdom despite its shortcomings. There's another poem about life's brevity in chapter 10, 20 through 12, 8. This is the part of Ecclesiastes that metaphorically describes the aging process. Let's look at that for just a minute in chapter 12. He says in chapter 12, remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no delight in them. What are the evil days that he's talking about there? Getting old and the difficulty that brings to life. And he goes on to describe that. Before the sun, the light, the moon, and the stars are darkened, and clouds return after the rain. What do you think that's a picture of? Maybe loss of eyesight? In the day the watchmen of the house tremble, and mighty men stoop. The grinding ones stand idle because they are few, and those who look through windows grow dim. Now again, men have tried to unpack some of this language, and it's kind of opaque. It's not. People have thought he's describing different things here. But what would be the day that the watchmen of the house tremble? Could be the hands shaking as a part of old age. Mighty men stoop. Again, as you get older, typically you start to bend over. You're not as erect as you were as a young person. The grinding ones stand idle because they are few. What would that be? Your teeth. And the impact that has on your ability to chew up and eat food. Those who look through windows grow dim. Again, that could be the eyes. Looking out and not seeing as clearly as they did before. The doors on the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low, and one will arise at the sound of the bird, and all the daughters of song will sing softly. It seems like all that's related to hearing, the fact that you're not hearing as well as you once did, and maybe you're more easily startled as a result of that. Furthermore, men are afraid of a high place and of terrors on the road. I think it's fair to say I'm starting to move into this period of life myself. You're you're more afraid of things maybe than you were as a young person. That's typical. A lot of times you don't think or worry about things being dangerous as a young person, and you think about it more as you get older. So all of this just has to do with the fact that as you get older, life gets harder. And he's encouraging you, on the one hand, as a young person, to enjoy life while you can, while your body is strong, while you don't have these kinds of infirmities. But listen to the way that he says it. Now this is actually back up in chapter 11, verses 9 and 10. Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Boy, it sounds like he's giving you a lot of license there. But what does he say next? Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So judgment here is intended to be a guard against sin. Yes, you can enjoy life as a young person. You can enjoy all that God has created in a good way, in a pleasant way. But don't go too far. Recognize that God will judge in the end. And then the conclusion in 9 through 14 rather. Let me just pick it up in verse 12. Beyond this, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. Again, Solomon should know that as well as anybody, because of all the proverbs that he sought out, the writing that he did. And if you talk to anybody who's a scholar today in any field, biblical studies or others, it's a hard thing to study. It wears you out mentally. It wears you out if you sit in a chair a lot and do it. And I think he's just making note of that. This is kind of a theme verse for when you're in seminary in particular, because you're doing a lot of reading and it's wearying to the body. The conclusion, and again, this is his ultimate conclusion at the very end of the book, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it's good or evil. So on the one hand, does that not only keep us from sin, but it also keeps us from wanting to take retaliation or vengeance on somebody who's sinning against us. We can leave that to the Lord. And Paul says the same thing in Romans, not to take your own vengeance, but to leave room for the wrath of God. Knowing that God will judge and make everything right in the end helps us deal with present difficulties. All right, so having gone through the book in that fashion, what would you say are the major themes? We've touched on them as we've gone through, but what are the things that this book addresses over and over again?
To fear God.
Fear God. 5 different times he says to do that.
The nature of wisdom.
The nature of wisdom. The fact that it's great compared to folly, but limited as well. Death. Death is a major theme in Ecclesiastes, because Solomon recognizes it will happen to everybody. And again, he's reflecting on the curse where death was officially introduced into the creation. The fact that from dust we came and from dust we will return. To dust we will return. What else? Joy. The joy refrain, 7 different times in the book. He's saying, despite the difficulties, you can still enjoy life. And he gives some very practical things that you do that. Enjoy your wife. Enjoy food that God provides. Enjoy even the ability to work, and to recognize that work is something that can give you satisfaction. And it has its rewards. All right, those are good. Let me put some more up here. We mentioned already the futility of life. He calls it vanity and striving after wind. He is looking at things under the sun for most of the book. Now, at the end, he kind of moves beyond just this life under the sun by looking at God's judgment at the very end. And that makes a big difference in the final message of the book. But he's looking at things the way that they occur in this life for both believers and unbelievers. I don't think he's restricting this to unbelievers. Fear God, Isaiah said, Life's inequities is a major part of the book. The frustrating nature of work. The uselessness of pleasure. Again, not absolute uselessness, but the fact that it can't ultimately bring perfect satisfaction and meaning to life. Uncorrected injustice. He says at a certain point that the reason men sin and are committed to sin is because justice is not brought swiftly. We certainly see that in our world. The unknowableness of life and of the future in particular. He's asking, what is it that satisfies ultimately? He said joy, judgment, death, wisdom. God's sovereignty is a major part of this book as well. The fact that God rules over time and that he knows things that we don't know. And so God has so worked in order that we might fear him, is what he says. All right, so let's look now a little closer at some of Solomon's conclusions on life, and we'll look at some individual verses here. He says, don't look for the answer to life and pleasure. These are, again, from Dave Duell. Let me read a couple of these. This is Ecclesiastes 2:1. I said to myself, come now, I'll test you with pleasure, so enjoy yourself, and behold, it too is futility. And then again in verse 11, thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind. There was no profit under the sun. If you make pleasure your goal, you'll be disappointed. Joy is important, but sometimes we have to wait to get it. We're not going to have joy all the time, and we need to recognize that and wait for it to come. And when it comes, we can receive it from the Lord as one of his good gifts. Secondly, don't expect to know the future. Ecclesiastes 3:10. I've seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He's made everything appropriate in its time. He's also set eternity in their heart so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. So again, he's expressing his frustration with not being able to see the big picture. And yet, we have an idea of the big picture, right? As human beings, we can know that there's been this long string of humanity that existed before us. There's history that records some of that. We can also know that there's going to be a long row of people that live after us, after we've passed off the scene. So we have eternity in our hearts in that sense, but we can't go beyond that a lot. We can't recognize the day that we're going to die. We can't know, for another example, when Christ is going to come back. We know that he's going to, and we just trust the Lord with that. Rest in the fact that though God has appointed time for everything, you can't always know what that time will be. Don't expect fairness in this life. Fairness does not characterize this life. And you can't fix everything, as much as we'd like to sometimes. But we can still enjoy life in spite of that. Don't try to find satisfaction in wealth or in what wealth can accomplish. Now again, there's nothing wrong with wealth. It's not wealth itself that's evil. It's the love of money that's the root of all sorts of evil. And God prospers us differently. Again, I mentioned this earlier. We come into the world in different circumstances, and we have no choice over that. We have no choice in the family into which we're born, the country into which we're born. And from that, our educational opportunities could be limited one way or the other. So there's a lot that we have no control over. But we all come into the world with a portion. And you've heard stories of people that go from rags to riches because they worked hard and perhaps came into the world with very little opportunity, but that changed over the course of their life. Well, what God is saying here is you shouldn't pursue wealth in itself as the ultimate end, but just work hard, enjoy life, live wisely, and let God prosper you accordingly. He also addresses the fact that our wealth and our possessions can impact us. They can impact our heart. He says in chapter 5, verse 10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. This too doesn't make sense, right? To have money as the goal and you keep getting more and more of it, and yet you keep wanting more and more at the same time. You've heard of rich people that are that way. I think about these athletes sometimes, and the fact that they're willing to change teams just because they'll get paid more money. Well, they're already making millions of dollars. They perhaps are playing on a team that they played with for most of their career in a town where they're highly regarded, and yet they're willing to jump to another team just to make more money. And at some point you think, well, what's the difference between $5 million and $10 million? I mean, you can't spend all that money in your lifetime anyway. I think that's what Solomon is addressing here. Don't expect enjoyment at all times. You don't know what's going to happen. Certainly there will be times that you don't enjoy life. Nevertheless, enjoy life. He says in Ecclesiastes 9:1, "For I've taken this to my heart and explain it, that righteous men, wise men, and their deeds are in the hand of God. Man does not know whether it will be love or hatred, anything awaits him." So again, even those who know God, who fear him, who keep his commandments, don't know always what's going to happen to them. And ultimately, you trust God through that. So the summary is enjoy life because your satisfaction comes from the hand of God in a sin-cursed world. Now this, I think, is the last slide, or close to the last one, and Solomon's balance of enjoyment with judgment. Solomon is very concerned about the outcome of all his activity. He recognizes that God rewards obedience and punishes disobedience. That's the way that God has designed life to work, and that's what we talked about, especially as we were looking at the book of Proverbs. But what about Job? There's times where God himself sovereignly intervenes to interrupt that pattern of rewarding good behavior and punishing disobedience. So there are apparent exceptions to that rule. Believe that God has appointed a time in which to judge you. This is Ecclesiastes 3:17. "I said to myself, God will judge both the righteous man and the wicked man, for a time for every matter and for every deed is there." And we also know from 2 Corinthians 5:10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may be recompensed for his deeds in the body, according to what he's done, whether good or bad. That's talking about us as believers. And that's an appropriate thing to keep in mind, again, not only to keep you from sinning, but also to do positive things, to do things that honor the Lord, recognizing that He sees all that we do. Don't let the delayed nature of judgment serve as an excuse to disobey. This is what I was referring to earlier. He says in chapter 8, verse 11, "Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed quickly, therefore the hearts of the sons of men among them are given fully to do evil. Although a sinner does evil 100 times and may lengthen his life, still I know that it will be well for those who fear God, who fear him openly." So sometimes the wicked prosper, and because they're not immediately judged for their wickedness, they think they're getting away with it. But you have to recognize that ultimately God will judge and bring justice. Control the root of disobedience within you with the thought of that judgment. Let the certainty of future judgment balance your enjoyment of life. We read 11:9 earlier. This is a guy named George Castellino, unless that's Spanish Castellino, I'm not sure. I've not heard of him before, but this is a quote from Zook's Biblical Theology of the Old Testament. He's kind of summarizing Solomon's message in conclusion. "Therefore set aside all anxious striving and labor. Avoid all speculation on God's ruling of the world." That is, don't try to second guess God. That's what Job was doing in effect. God rebuked him at the end of that book for that and said basically, just fear me. You know me, fear me. Be thankful to God for whatever satisfaction he gives you, valuing and measuring everything as a gift from him and enjoying it, not forgetting that you shall have to render a strict account to God himself. So another way of saying that, this is something we've tried to do on every book, is just give a purpose statement for the book. In light of his investigation and conclusions on the profit of man's labor, Solomon exhorts the young people of his kingdom, without admitting others, to enjoy life, but to know that judgment's coming. I think it is a book probably primarily written to younger people, but it has application for all of us. And I say that based on his exhortations at the end for the young person to enjoy life before he gets older. Here's a question. What's the difference between the book of Proverbs and the books of Job and Ecclesiastes with regard to the principle of God's retribution? How is God's retribution dealt with in the book of Proverbs?
Like generally?
Okay, so the way things generally are, and just real black and white, right? The righteous will prosper, the wicked will be judged. And there's a lot of contrast between the righteous and the wicked. What about in the books of Job and Ecclesiastes? Is it different from Proverbs in the way that it deals with God's retribution?
The exception?
It is the exceptions. So Proverbs deals with God's retribution in light of its consistency and in the light of the way generally things are. Job and Ecclesiastes look at instances where immediate outcomes are not what one might expect. And sometimes that's what Solomon is talking about when he says vanity of vanities. That phrase can mean different things in different contexts where he is in the book. Sometimes he's looking at it and saying, this doesn't seem like it should be this way. It's not always having to do with the brevity of life. Sometimes it has to do with irony and the outcome not being what you would expect it to be.
Like his friends, Job's friends, saying you've sinned, that's what's caused this. No, that's
Exactly.
not God allowed it.
That's right. His friends are assuming what Proverbs assumes, and that is that God punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. And so they're looking at his punishment and saying, well, you must have sinned. God doesn't bring this kind of calamity on people that haven't sinned. And his whole argument is not that he hasn't sinned at all, but that his punishment doesn't fit the crime. Okay, so next time, remember we read in 1 Kings 4 that Solomon wrote 1,005 songs. We have one of them recorded in the book of Psalms. This is the other one that's been preserved for us in Scripture. The title is actually The Song of Songs, or the Ultimate Song, which is Solomon's. Very different kind of Bible book. Ecclesiastes was too, but very different from anything else that we have in Scripture. And we'll be looking at that one next Sunday. It's pretty short, so if you want to try to read through it this week, just have that background. That'll be a good exercise. Any questions about Ecclesiastes? There's lots of good material out there, and if you have, if you're reading through it and you come on something that you'd like to have some more information about, let me know, and I can email you an article, or we can just talk about it ourselves. To me, it's a fascinating book. It's one that I've grown in my appreciation for. Just a very practical book about the nature of life and about especially life under the curse. Okay, let me have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we're thankful for all of your revelation, and we're thankful for the book of Ecclesiastes and the things that it teaches us. We recognize your sovereignty over time and over the future and over total wisdom. And we submit to that. We have enough revealed in your word to know you, to fear you, and to live for you in light of what you've done for us. Help us to do that regardless of what difficulties we walk through in this life, to always fear you and keep your commandments. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.